Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Barrow. I'm the Associate Publisher for the Journal Record. Thank you for coming. We know this is a very important topic. Let's see, I wanted to thank our sponsors, Hub International and Ogletree Deakins. Without sponsors, these type of events cannot take place. So I will go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our panelists first. Our moderator is Steve Metzer. He's on the far end. Steve's worked for the Journal Record for several years. He served as our capital correspondent, and now he is our associate editor. Gave you my title, whoops. And then to my left is Isaac Monson. He serves as the Assistant Vice President, Senior Risk Consultant for Hub International. He began his career as a state trooper for the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. He then worked in security and safety fields for companies such as Cummins, Inc. and Target before joining Hub in 2019. He holds a Master of Science in Safety Management from Indiana University. Vic Albert, in the middle there, is shareholder with Ogletree Deakins, an employment law firm. His practice focuses on the aspects of trial law with particular experience in the areas of labor and employment trials, insurance defense, bad faith trials, and trucking defense trials. Over the past 15 years, he's developed an employer-based practice advising employers in policy and development, training, hiring, firing, and investigation of employee complaints. He holds a BBA from the University of Oklahoma and a JD from Oklahoma City University School of Law. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists first. They're going to each have a few things to say, and then our moderator will get up and moderate the panel, and we'll have Q&A time. So thank you for joining us again, and I'm going to turn it over to Isaac. I believe he's going first.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, talk about this challenging topic. Certainly post-pandemic, many of our clients, really across all industries, are dealing with a new level of concern around this topic. And then additionally, as Vic and Steve will both allude to as we talk through this, there's a whole spectrum of things we have to be thinking about as businesses, as organizations in a community that employ people. And so we're going to each take a few minutes and talk through some of the foundational elements around this topic, and you'll see that we're talking about this in a comprehensive manner here. So I'll talk for about 15 minutes, and we'll move through some slides that cover a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about, and somebody nudge me if I get close to 15. So as described, I was a state police officer in Minnesota for close to 10 years prior to transitioning out and moving into private industry. And part of what has informed the way that I talk about this topic with clients really from all industries is an additional experience that I had in my professional life. And so what you see in this photo is a small conference room at one of my former employer's facilities. I was sitting in that office on a Thursday morning. We got a text message from the plant medic, and that text message said, "Someone's shooting people in the tech center." And so as I sat in this tiny room, it was a small focus room. I was hiding from the rest of the workforce. I was a safety engineer there, and really the only way that you can focus on the task at hand is to find a quiet place to sit down. So that morning I was actually sitting in this office conference room, and I took this photo 4 or 5 days later when we got access to the facility back after this shooting incident. And the reason that this photo, or this scene caught my attention is that cookie sitting precariously on that water bottle was going to be my breakfast that morning. And 4 or 5 days later, when we had custody of the building again and things were starting to move back into, I guess normal's not the right word, but as we tried to move back into the way we'd operated previously, that cookie sitting there grabbed my attention as just how significant and disruptive these kinds of events actually are. Unfortunately, that text message that we received was accurate information. An employee had shot and killed his manager and then shot and killed himself. That was over very quickly, but Nobody knew that at the time, so the facility evacuated, as you would, in a circumstance that is thought to be an active shooter incident. And so police response was swift. You can see from some of these photos, it was raining that morning. 1,000 employees spilled out into the streets looking for shelter in the community, shelter from the rain, but also not really knowing or understanding the scope of what was happening. So as we talk about this, active shooter is often the headline. That's often the driver for these conversations. When clients come to me as a risk consultant and say, we would like to do an active shooter training, can you help? I always have to reverse engineer that question and say, why are you asking that today? Is there an imminent threat that you're concerned about? Have you scoped or identified the need for a violence prevention program? And are you actually operationally ready to do a live drill around active shooter? So as you can hear in that line of questioning, there are a lot of things that we can do to stay in front of these types of events. And the goal with the violence prevention, intervention, and response program is to spend as much time and energy preventing and intervening as you are spending around your emergency response capability. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but there are some best practices that we talk to clients about all the time. You'll probably recognize some of this if you are an HR professional or a safety person or a business owner. It's really about managing known hazards. And so OSHA identifies 5 types of violence in the workplace. This helps you sort through where your risk might lie and what your controls might look and feel like. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but the way each of these plays out is different. Criminal intent, for example, would be an armed robbery circumstance or situation, whereas when you're talking about customer or client aggression or violence, that's going to be very different. The motivation is different. The way it actualizes is different. And so the way you manage it would be different. Type 3, worker versus worker, is interpersonal conflict in your workforce. Type 4, domestic violence, is essentially someone's home life bringing its way to the workplace. And when violence shows up in that capacity, the way you manage it is going to be very different than the way you would manage the first 3. And then lastly, extremist ideologies or terrorism, essentially. We're seeing an uptick in these kinds of incidents in places like grocery stores or schools or public environments, parades we've seen over the last number of months. And so the difference here, of course, is, again, it's a very different risk, a very different thing you would have to think about, and you may well not be at risk for that at all based on the industry that you're in. We also want to emphasize that most workplace violence doesn't involve a weapon or a firearm. More often we're talking about interpersonal conflict, pushing, shoving, other types of assaults. And so we can't be preoccupied with active shooter, with run, hide, fight. As an employer, we have to first think about and manage a lot of these non-weapon related violence activities, but also understand that unmanaged, uncontrolled, unassessed, any of these types of violence can potentially escalate into that worst case scenario, active shooter event. So that's the context that we have to think about this in. Interestingly, I'm not here to tell you the sky's falling. Violence in the United States has been trending downward for a number of years. There's plenty of data to support that. You wouldn't know that in your Facebook feed or on your Twitter, following your Twitter accounts. You would think quite the opposite. But for better or worse, violence has been trending in the right direction. The flip side of that coin is these active shooter events keep happening. So, significant increase, I think 52% from 2020 to 2021. And there's no indication that that's going to trend in the right direction anytime soon. But as employers, we have unique things to think about in this context. But we try and reframe this and talk about managing known hazards, because we already do this. If you're an employer, you're doing this well already. It's the same framework, it's just a different approach. So imagine, if you will, it's 110 degrees in Oklahoma, and you have a workforce that goes out into the field. You're outdoors, you're commuting. On a day when it's that hot, as an employer, you likely have a process in place to talk about how do we prevent heat illness? How do we ensure that our workforce isn't having a heat stroke out in the field in any given day? Same framework, same approach. When we become aware of a known hazard, when we become aware of a threat of violence, we have to have some basic processes in place to assess it, to manage it, and to protect our workforce. At Hub, we talk pretty exclusively about a concept as left of loss. So if you look at this timeline, we're essentially saying spend as much time and energy on prevention and intervention to prevent these things from occurring, as opposed to spending all your time and energy on being really good at responding to emergencies. You got to do all of it, but when we talk about violence and violence prevention, the most actionable part of these programs or of these processes is going to be threat assessment and threat management. So if you look through this, there are a number of different types of threats that you might think about or manage, and it does not have to be exclusively a very direct statement. I don't have to say, I'm going to come to the office and shoot people for it to be a threat. There can be indirect threats, veiled threats. You can feel threatened by someone's behaviors or someone's activities without a direct verbal threat toward a person. So we have to think about and manage all of this stuff. This is actually a screenshot from a threat assessment tool put together by Paycom. If you're not familiar with that, it's a fabulous structured judgment tool, and we'll talk more about that later. But the point is that when we say put together a violence prevention program, I don't mean a bunch of documents and paperwork on your shelf that nobody can speak to. We're talking about building a capability within your organization to assess and manage a threat when you become aware of it. So the next question is typically, well, that sounds logical. How do we do that? What does that look like? So there are a number of tools and resources we point folks towards, but here we're looking at a structured judgment process or a basic workflow that kind of helps your team sit down and assess threats of violence in real time. And we'll talk about this more specifically, but the goal here is prevention. And for every active shooter incident that happens, that you see in the headlines, there are countless examples of violence that was prevented or that has made less risky by some sort of intervention, but you're likely not going to see or hear about those. But that's the goal in assessing and managing threats. So to add some color to that, just real quickly, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of an employment team who's been made aware of a concerning statement that was made. And this is just how you move through this process as a threat assessment and threat management team with an employer context. So let's do a low concern threat example. Let's say a current employee makes a single angry statement about a coworker and it gets reported. And the statement was, he's so rude to me, I could kill him sometimes. So we're informed, so now it's a known hazard, we've heard about it. What are we going to do? We're going to sit down and work through this process, and essentially, we've been made aware of a threat, so now we need to sit down and assess it and think about, is this serious, is it imminent, what kind of resources do we need to engage? And as you move through this on a low concern example, let's say we sit down and start talking to the people involved. HR goes directly to the person and says, someone said you told someone else you were going to kill a person. And they say, yeah, sorry, I said that. I shouldn't have said that. I'm upset with my manager. I'm not being managed well. We're not getting along. I would never kill him. Poor choice of words. Apologies. You go back and look through his personnel file. You find out he's a long-standing great employee. Nobody's concerned about him. No history of violence. No other warning signs. So in this case, we're going to decide pretty quickly there's not concern warranted here. We're not calling the police. We're not calling a security vendor for armed guards at the door. This is a manage it internally kind of conversation, but you continue to monitor. The flip side of that is a high-risk threat. So let's use this example. Let's say an office staffer was terminated for shoving a coworker, and now from home, they're threatening you online. And unfortunately, this is an all too common situation that I help clients navigate through. But this online threat of violence is kind of at epidemic levels, and it very often doesn't mean anything, but it's happening, and employers are concerned and have to think about it. So let's say you see a Facebook post that says, watch the news tonight, old boss is going to get it. So we know right out of the gate this is a much more serious thing to be thinking about, as opposed to the long-standing good employee who said, I could kill that guy, right? So we're managing this differently. So we know we're going to be doing an initial review, same process, same team of people. This isn't a big, complicated process. This is a 5 to 10 minute sit down with your key leaders and stakeholders, probably legal counsel, to make sure that you're doing this in an appropriate way. But you move through this process and try and decide, is concern warranted? In this case, absolutely concern is warranted. So let's say you talk to the former colleagues and they say, everyone was afraid of this guy. He was always threatening people. He was always saying things that made people uncomfortable. We know he owns firearms. He showed us one in the parking lot after work one day. We don't feel safe. And everyone's probably seen the Facebook post, right? So you got a different thing on your hands to manage here. In this case, probably an emergency response. We're probably calling law enforcement for support, for assessment, for management. You might likely move through a much different and ongoing assessment and management process. I won't spend a lot of time here, but the point is these are two very different known hazards, and the way you manage them and think about them need to be different. The active shooter component of this, the emergency response part, looks and feels very similar to fire response, tornado emergency type response. You essentially have to have a process defined, you have to have it documented, and your employees need to be trained to understand it. So in an active shooter situation, you're going to respond very differently than you would respond in a fire emergency, for example. But if employees haven't been trained and made aware of the difference, you might default to the fire response, right? You might go out and stand in the parking lot in large groups and wait for a head count. When in an active shooter situation, you're obviously wanting to disperse and keep moving until the threat is gone. So the point is it's different. It needs to be defined and understood differently, and that's part of what the employer's responsibility is along that timeline that we discussed. There's a large body of knowledge that informs how you do this. I didn't make this stuff up. If you take nothing else from this, look for this document. This is a national standard document that defines this. It's co-authored by HR and security professionals, big consensus group. And the framework that we talked to is from there. So I'm going to hand off to Vic. Did I make my 15 minutes? We'll see. But these are some handouts we'll leave behind and make available about how to do that and how to move through that. And if you have any questions around program development, feel free to follow up with us after. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. So first thing I would say is if I was an employer, I would keep Isaac's card handy, and I would call them in and have a consultation with them right away. You know, when we sat down and started talking about this presentation and what we would cover and bring to you, one of the things that was a common theme was if you've gotten to the point where you have an active shooter on site, then you've got to handle that crisis, but it may be something that could have been prevented if other steps had been taken prior to that. And Isaac and his group would be one of those very beneficial steps that employers should look at, spending some time and some resources, bringing that into the workplace to help have a plan and to help try to prevent these things from happening in the workplace. We can all look at just this past history in the last 6 months and know that we never know when we could be in the midst of a violent situation. We never know when somebody may show up with a loaded weapon and start shooting. And you know, that has now transcended into our schools, into our grocery stores, into the 4th of July parades, into our doctor's offices. And so it's not one of those situations that we've heard of historically where you're looking at the situation and thinking, oh my goodness, this only happens in blue-collar manufacturing environments where somebody is really rude or mean to somebody. This happens in everyday life. And so as an employer, as a business owner, you've got to be looking at the different ways that you can protect the people that are in your workspace. That includes your employees, it includes your guests, it includes your customers and your clients. And so all of these ideas that we are bringing to you today are along that lines and are to further that idea of what can you do, mostly ahead of the event happening, some things after the event happening that I'll talk about from the legal perspective. But it's just very vital and important for employers these days to not put this on the back burner, to make this as important as all of your other very important initiatives. It's as important as your diversity initiative. It's as important as your health and wellness initiatives. It's as important as all of your business-driven profit issues. So make this something that you do spend some time over the next few months considering, looking at your workplace and deciding is there something you can do different or better, and then bringing in an expert like Isaac and his group to help you with identifying what you can do to protect your workplace and your customers and clients. So when we look at this issue from the legal perspective, you know, if we get to the active shooter in the workplace, we're probably too late. These are things that we would recommend from a legal perspective, 6 very important points that you consider that you as an employer or you as a business owner serving a customer base or a client base can do to try to insulate and protect against unexpected violence coming into your workshop. So, number 1, a crisis management team. And many of you are going to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not a big enough employer to need that. I don't have enough people coming into my workplace to need that. Everything here is dependent on what kind of work you do, what kind of service you provide, who are your customers and clients, and then how large your company is. The larger the company, the more people you serve, the more the need for you to have some violence prevention aspect that you bring to the training and policies in your business or your company. So having a crisis management team, somebody that goes into effect right when a violent act happens, that's very important. And if you look at these different events that have happened just in the last 6 months, from the organization standpoint, where the criticisms have come after the fact is that they didn't have a crisis management team, that they didn't have somebody that was appointed to take responsibility for certain things that needed to be done. And so this is something that, depending on the size of your organization, needs to be put into place. But even in the smallest employers, even in the smallest group of clients or customers, you should think about having somebody appointed to be your crisis management team leader and then some form of a team. The violence policy, we'll talk about this a little bit more. The information campaign. So you've got your crisis management team and you've got your violence policy, and then you're going to need to put that information out. You need to make sure that your workforce knows what the policies are, who the go-to people are in this regard. And then the emergency response plan, an actual plan that is put into place and educated to your employees and maybe even your customers or clients that if something should happen, this is what needs to be happened. These are the steps to take. Isaac illustrated for you his own personal situation in that regard, and that is actually an emergency response plan that you hear in action in that situation. Vitally important here is supervisor training. A lot of companies fail because they have great policies and they have great teams and they just don't train their managers and supervisors. And so it is vitally important for this area that you have great communication with your managers and supervisors, and then you have great communications with your employees and your colleagues that are going to follow the plan and follow the policies. But communication here is the vital aspect. You have got to have some great communication through the supervisor training with your managers and supervisors and with your employees. And then finally, the customer compliance aspect, that you have expectations on the other people coming into your workplace who are not necessarily employees, who are going to be expected to abide by certain rules in regard to harassment, violence, those kind of things. So diving in here, Isaac talked a lot about this, but recognizing violence. This is where a lot of companies fall down because they don't have in place these systems or this training to recognize where something that starts out relatively small as a conflict between two people then grows and grows and grows and never gets headed off, and it becomes an act of violence in the workplace. An act of workplace violence is any act of aggression or threat of an act that threatens the safety, security, or well-being of an individual who is at work or on duty. So that's a nice, dictionary version of that. But, let's look at potential markers. There are markers that we know, and this is not profiling, but there are just behavioral markers that we know. And Isaac has touched on some of these that are good markers for when there is the potential for something to go awry with that individual or with somebody connected with that individual. And so you've got the discussion or the fascination with weapons. In Oklahoma, we face that a lot because there's a lot of people here who have guns, who have weapons. And so an over discussion about that, an over fascination with that is a behavioral marker. Not necessarily that that person is going to bring that to work and become violent, but it's just something to note. When you have people that are familiar with weapons and guns and they talk about them frequently, that's something you want to know. When you have people that talk a lot about the right to have an automatic weapon, we see that a lot after these shootings have happened in our society, that there was some fascination with automatic weapons. So that's one behavioral marker that you might want to note. People that come to work under the influence of drugs or alcohol, signs of severe stress, violent history, signs of poor psychological functioning, blaming others for everything. These are the kind of things that are a marker of problems with that worker that could become something more. And so you want to have, we'll talk about this just a little bit more, but you want to have that training and that identification with your managers and supervisors to look for these things. And let's face it, hopefully and rarely do these things turn into an active shooter in the workplace, but they are things that show a distraction from what you're trying to do at your work. Your work is not about the right to have an automatic weapon. Your work is about making a product or providing a service. You've got customers. And so anything along these lines, these behavioral markers, distracts from what you are doing and what your business is doing or your agency is doing to provide a service or a good. So keep these in mind. Other behavioral markers. These are the kind of things that indicate that something is just maybe not going great with that employee. And so you're looking at decreased or inconsistent productivity. That's something that needs to be addressed. Isolation or poor peer relationships. Maybe that's something that needs to be addressed, maybe it's not, but just know that that's a marker. That's something that you can look at to see that there's maybe something that could go awry with that employee. Poor personal hygiene, drastic changes in personality, threats of bodily harm. Isaac mentioned, a couple of examples. The point is, in society these days, employers can't take anything for granted. So yes, I really like the flow chart of how to handle those types of reports that he talked about and those situations. Everything needs to be individualized like that. But there needs to be at least some analysis and approach, even to those things that just sound like an exaggeration of a statement that was never serious. Objectification and dehumanization. All of these things are markers that something is going to go awry with that employee or could go awry with that employee. Incidents of bullying. And when we talk about bullying, that's a problem in the workplace. It's a problem in the workplace because the workplace is the place where most of your employees spend most of their time. And so there is an outlet there that a lot of employees have because of their position in the workplace or just because of the working environment where they can exude some bullying behavior. Bullying is one of those things on both sides of that relationship that can lead to violence. The person doing the bullying has already shown a tendency to act different than they should be acting. The person receiving the bullying, you see this a lot of times discussed after these shooting events, that it was somebody who was bullied for many years in their life. And so these are the kind of markers that employers want to be looking for and want to be trying to work with managers and supervisors to identify and address so that they don't lead to a violent situation in the workplace. Now, this slide here, I won't sit here and go through all of this, but these are commonly reported behaviors that are indicated as bullying, that lead to worse, that lead to harassment potentially. And I'll say this as well, my presentation is available to you if you will email me, and my email address will be up here at the end, Isaac's as well. If you want these presentations, if you'll send me an email, I'll be glad to just email to you the slide deck, and then you can have it for your review. But these points are commonly reported behaviors that have led to bullying or harassment in the workplace. From the employer perspective, these are the things that are viewed as the employer being a bully. And so you have this problem when you're dealing with this issue as well. A lot of times, the person that acts out, they're acting out because they feel like the employer is a bully, or the manager or supervisor is a bully. And as you see here, the number one thing is, it's all about the numbers. Everything is very not personal in the workplace. There's no concern or care for the employees. It's just all about the numbers. And so employers and agencies have to really look at what is it we're providing, what is our goal, and how do we do it in a way that is mutually respectful with our employees and with our workforce. And so moving through here, as we talked about, we have these 6 things that employers can do and should do as best practices to try to head off violence in the workplace or harassment or bullying in the workplace. And so rolling through here and talking about these, the management team, crisis management team responsibilities. So you want to put together a system that you are gathering up a team of people. They talk about the situation, they talk about the potentials, they talk about the problems in the workplace that they can identify already, and then they start putting in place some action steps to address the situation. Then they also talk about what if there's a crisis? What if there's a tornado? What if there's a shooting? What if there is something that happens, severe cold or ice storm that closes us down for several days? These are the crisis management situations that your team is designed to address. And I won't go through all of these, but again, these are the responsibilities of a good crisis management team that is formed and based on the size and type of work that you are doing. The next thing was the policy. I know that you're looking at your workplace and you're saying, man, we have so many policies already. They're really not even effective because we have so many policies. Think about what's most important to your workplace. And one of the things that's most important these days is no violence in the workplace. No bullying in the workplace, no harassment in the workplace, no weapons on site in our workplace buildings. So those are the kind of things that you only educate your workforce about them if you have a policy. So it's very important for you to have a policy. Our firm does these routinely for companies, and then it's very important that you provide the right training. These are some things that the policy will highlight. It will highlight all of the aspects of weapons in the workplace, of violence, of harassment, and most importantly, it will talk about the duty to report incidents that the individual considers to be violent, aggressive, harassment, or bullying, so that you as an employer can then know about that and then take action on it. The information campaign. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we've talked about it a little bit already, but again, you want your employees to know front and center that violence in the workplace will not be tolerated, that harassment in the workplace will not be tolerated, fighting and bullying will not be tolerated. And so you've got to put that message out there. However it is that you communicate with your employees, whether it's through annual training or whether it's through some periodic training, this is important for them to know. That you have a commitment, that your workplace has a commitment to no violence, bullying, or harassment in the workplace. The emergency response team. Again, we've talked about this, but this is different than your crisis management team. This is the team that's going to go into action the minute that text comes in that there's an active shooter. And this is the team that is going to then do, each member does what he or she is designated to do, so that the coordination of efforts and the de-escalation of the event, or at least the safety and security of the people involved at the work site, can be most effectively handled. Supervisor training. Again, nothing more important than having in place the right policies, the right philosophy, and then doing that training with the supervisors. And a lot of times, supervisors and managers push back on training because they think, look, I know this already. I wouldn't be a manager or supervisor if I didn't already know this. Doesn't this aspect of no violence in the workplace seem relatively common sense? Why do I need to have more training on this? It's because they need to really understand the importance of it, and they really need to understand the other pieces of this, the policy, the crisis management team, the emergency response team. But then they need to take that information and that message to your employees, because that's where the real communication goes on about this. So it's vitally important to have the right supervisor training. And then you've got to, whatever industry you're in, you've got to do some kind of customer or vendor training. Now, this is more just information because you can't require them to come to training. But here's the situation where you're trying to let people that are coming into your workplace who are not directly controlled by your policies and your procedures, where you're letting them know this is what is okay, this is what is expected. You go into offices or establishments all the time that have signs up that say, no weapons, all right? Now, I know we're going to get into issues about does a person in Oklahoma have a right to carry a weapon, concealed carry, and all of this. The point is, as an employer, you still have the right to have some policies in place that deal with that. You still have the right to post a sign that says that, and that your expectation is that people are not bringing weapons into your place of business. If there's an issue with that later on, that can be dealt with as that issue comes up. But you need to do everything you can to try to guard the safety and security of your employees and of your customers that are coming to your workplace. Finally, from the legal perspective, we have this relatively new law in Oklahoma. And again, if you'll email me, I can give you more information on it. But it's the Oklahoma Protection from Workplace Harassment and Violence Act. And this act applies to every employer, and that phrase employer is defined very broadly in the act. So if you are an individual and you have one employee, you're subject to the act. And then it moves on from there. So basically every employer in Oklahoma is subject to the act. What the act provides is a way that if there's been a pattern of conduct that constitutes harassment or violence in the workplace, then the employer, in the employer's name, can go to the court and ask the court to issue some relief against the harassing party or the party that has had bad conduct. Now, there needs to be 2 discrete acts of some type of harassment or violence reported, and then the employer has the basis to go to the court and ask the court for these forms of relief. Basically ordering that the harasser stay away from the workplace, restraining the harasser from contacting the employer or the employee in the workplace, and any other relief that is necessary. And so it's the way that our legislature has responded to workplace violence to provide a victim's protection order that the employer, in the employer's name, can go and get on behalf of the employee. It's a relatively new law. It hasn't been used very much. The times our firm has used it has been when it's been one employee against another employee. We had a situation recently where an employee was mad at another employee and brought a gun to work and shot him. And so everyone survived, thankfully, but our office was hired by the employer to come in and get injunctive relief to keep that shooter away from the place of business and from contacting anybody associated with the business. And so it's a very effective process from that perspective. So this is something that employers can do, but you can only do it if you have the right record, if you have the 2 events that can be used to tell the judge, we need to take some action here. So know that this is something that is available to employers. The act says that there is no liability if the employer takes action or doesn't take action. So again, there's some safeguard built in there, so it doesn't expand employer liability. It just gives employers the basis to go get a victim's protection order on behalf of the employee or on behalf of the workplace. So at that point, I'm done with my presentation. We will take our panel questions. Again, here's my email address. Isaac's got his on his introductory slide as well. And we would be glad to have you contact us and ask us any questions you have.
Well, all right. Thank you very much. My name is Steve Metzer, and I'm the assistant editor at the Journal Record. And what I thought I would do is just ask some questions that some specific employers, large and small both, might consider when they come up with their own policies for trying to prevent violence in the workplace. And I might invite people in the audience to come up with their own questions if they have some that might be specific to their own businesses. We've covered a lot. You guys did a great job. This is a very difficult topic that can be discussed for hours on end. We do have a very limited amount of time, so we'll try to just touch on some highlight questions that people might have. And again, if you have specific questions for them, keep their email addresses in mind. But the first question that I had is if a small business or a large business, either one, might be obligated or might consider that they should spend a specific amount of money on developing a plan in their budget, if there's a percentage in their budget that they should consider spending on violence prevention.
Sure, I'll tackle that first. So in terms of specific amounts of money, the nice thing about what I get to talk to hub clients about is that it doesn't cost a lot of money to take on most of the things that we're talking about. Initially, they're administrative controls in nature, so the same way you have an existing safety management system that accounts for driver safety or fall protection or food safety or whatever industry you're in, the violence prevention component often plugs and plays real nicely into those existing safety management systems. There's an OSHA component to this as well, so employers are bound to protect their employees from known hazards, and violence is a known hazard. It's hard to argue that it's not anymore, but most of the things that we advocate for are basic drafting of policies, procedures, employee handbook language, and then some very basic training upon new hire and annually, or if a supervisor, a new person is promoted into a supervisory role. So those things can be accomplished for a relatively inexpensive amount of money. It's the person hours for those training activities and maybe some support from outside counsel on developing policy, but it's not expensive, and it's a relatively low barrier to entry on this stuff.
Sure, and I would say it's not necessarily a percentage amount. It's just an amount. I mean, if I was an employer, I would have Isaac's group come in and do what they do as far as assessing my workplace and assessing potential risk, and then giving me the advice, because that would be money well spent. And then in terms of, do you need to come to a lawyer and have a lawyer develop policies and things? Well, number one, it just again depends, and I think Isaac's group would be a good guide for you in that regard. If you don't have a policy, SHRM and other HR groups, they have plenty of them. And so you could do that relatively inexpensively. It's a type thing that our firm does all the time, but I do it as freebies for clients all the time because it's a basic policy. It just needs to be tooled to your workplace. So don't let cost dissuade you from taking this very important action. As you've seen in the news this year, workplace violence affects all of our industries and all of the things we do. And so we just never know when it's going to break out or happen, and it may happen from somebody who's not even your employee. And so you've got to be ready for it. Whatever you spend on it is going to be money well spent.
Well, I assure you that we support clients all the time who've had an act of violence in the workplace, and the cost of that disruption and getting back to what your normal operating state was is far more costly than the prevention efforts are. So there's my pitch for prevention.
All right. Another question that some businesses might consider is whether it might be sensible or even legal to adopt a policy that would either discourage or even prohibit employees from taking up certain conversations that might be real divisive in the workplace, or wearing a t-shirt or a hat that might have a slogan on it that might be considered disagreeable to other people. Are those kinds of policies sensible for businesses to consider?
So, yes. I mean, every kind of policy is sensible to consider. You've got to balance that, you've got something that you are trying to do with your workplace, either providing a good or a service or a combination of that. And then how are you going to efficiently get that done? Now, one way to address these concerns is have a dress code. Have a dress code that says T-shirts with graphics are not allowed, period. You don't have to explain why. And if you tell employees this is our dress code, you're enforcing a uniformly applied dress code. You are not taking away their First Amendment rights. The First Amendment doesn't even apply to private employers. So private employers that are not government related may issue certain requirements on the workplace. We've had situations where bumper stickers or huge paint displays on cars parked at a workplace can be addressed by the employer if they are something that is inflammatory. We've had recently a lot of situations with the old Confederate flag being displayed very prominently on vehicles in the workplace parking lot, and because of issues that have been present forever but have really come to light in the last 3 years, we've had employers come and say, no, that is not tolerable. And so as a private employer, an employer can do that. But to answer your question, you've got to balance your employees' rights to be the person they are and to have their own political views and their own social views against how that transcends to becoming potential bullying or harassment in the workplace. And it is worth spending time and money to examine that in your workplace and to have the appropriate policies that are non-discriminatory but to promote no violence and no bullying in the workplace.
I might just follow up. You mentioned in your presentation about social media, and you might pick up on clues. Would it be sensible for a business to have someone on staff that monitors social media as a rule to see what their employees are posting? And
so
how intrusive might that be, really?
You kind of already have that, because when you have employees in the workplace, they tend to get to know everyone else, and then they tend to try to connect with everyone else. And again, this is a generational thing. I'm not even on social media, so other than LinkedIn. But you have employees of the younger generations that are all over social media. They're monitoring each other, and they're coming and reporting things. So do you need to have somebody on staff that's monitoring that? I would say no, unless you get some type of word from someone that somebody's displaying a lot of messages on social media about guns, about weapons, about potential violent acts. That's when you need to then maybe make a focused review of somebody's social media so that you can identify the threat more. But I don't know that I would go so far as to tell employers that they need to have hours devoted toward just looking at employees' social media. I don't know that there's a benefit there.
Just to add to that, the threat assessment and threat management process often includes open source intelligence monitoring, the point at which you're aware of a threat, or if you've had a high-risk termination, or if you've been called out publicly on social media for some business decision, or fill in the blank. But you can very quickly become the focus of a group of people on the internet that might become threatening in a physical way. We're going to protest your facility, we're going to protest your event, fill in the blank with what the outcome might be. But there's a point at which in the threat assessment and threat management process, your crisis management team or your threat assessment team might recognize the importance of having visibility to the threat landscape. And that's not something you need to do internally necessarily, but the point at which you identify a threat that you deem credible and you're partnering with law enforcement potentially, you can also partner with security firms for social media monitoring, and they do it at a very high level. It's very effective. They have tools that the average person would not. And then you're not depending on social media savvy of someone in-house. You can outsource that to people that do that full time, and they can provide reports back to you about what's been posted, where you've been mentioned, your company or people by name or executives, high profile people within an organization. And oftentimes that's as simple as somebody finding a business owner on LinkedIn identified as the owner or the CEO of a company, and they can become the target of all kinds of things online. So the threat assessment and threat management component is hugely connected to social media activity now. And as you see in the news, very often the shooting stories kind of very quickly are able to outline what they would call early warning signs that are online on social media. So very quickly after these events, we see pretty quick accounting of what the person was doing online in the days and weeks leading up to the shooting incident. So social media monitoring is hugely important, the point at which you're aware of a concerning behavior or person or a threat.
This next question is kind of long, so I'm going to read it. I'll try to read it slowly. Legally speaking, how intrusive can a company be in asking questions of employees or potential employees and trying to determine if they might pose potential threats? Does the ADA address mental health from the standpoint of providing accommodations for people who might be considered as a threat? And then on the flip side of that, would it be legal to fire someone who might just simply, that people just might not feel comfortable around? They don't really have a specific thing that they might justify that makes them uncomfortable, but something's just not right about this person. Can that person be fired?
So thank you for the bar exam question, because that's what that sounds like. I would say this. One, there's a whole different set of laws that apply to what you can and can't ask and when you can and can't ask it in the application process. And so, knowing about a person's physical or mental restrictions or disabilities, you can't even go there in the initial phases of an interview. There's a whole aspect of background checks and the background check that you can run as an employer, but what you can and can't consider there. You can consider convictions for felonies. You may not consider arrests that don't result in conviction. So, already we're navigating through a whole bunch of different little areas here. Then you get to the point that you have an employee. The aspects of the ADA, both in they don't really come into play in the application process, because you have to have already made a conditional job offer to the employee, and then, you find out about any other medical or physical type issues, and then you can only use those to not hire the applicant if they would prevent that person from doing the essential functions of the job. So getting very legalese about it, it's going to be very hard through the interview process. It's going to be mostly through the background check process that you're going to find out propensities for harassment or violence from an applicant. Once they get into your workplace and the talk about the ADA, and does the ADA protect mental issues that could become harassment or violent issues? No. So the ADA protects physical and mental disabilities, and there's been a great expansion of what mental disabilities are or mental restrictions are, but nothing ever protects violence or harassment or bullying in the workplace. And there is plenty of case law that says the ADA cannot be used as an excuse for misconduct or for potential misconduct. So there's always that thing that comes in about safety in the workplace for others that takes precedent over any consideration with the ADA. So if that situation is there, again, like any ADA situation or disability situation, you want to look at it individually and you want to analyze it individually. But you would never have to compromise safety in the workplace because somebody may have a mental instability that could become violent. And then finally, the question about, what was the last part?
Firing someone if people are just uncomfortable.
Firing somebody if people are uncomfortable around them. We are an at-will employment state. So that means An employer may fire an employee for any reason at all, as long as it doesn't discriminate. So you can't fire people on protected status like gender, age, race, national origin, sexual orientation. You can't fire people because of that. You can't fire somebody because they have a disability that prevents them from doing their job, unless you've gone through an accommodation process with them. You can't fire somebody because they have an injury on the job. Those are the things that are protected. But if somebody's uncomfortable working around somebody, and there's reports of it, and there's an investigation, and it's determined that this person's just kind of creepy, or this situation of this male supervisor supervising all of these female employees on the night shift when there's very few other people around is just unstable, then yes, employment action can be taken for that reason, because it's not because of a protected status, it's because of something else that's being perceived. And so it falls into that general category that an employer may fire an employee for any reason or no reason at all, just because, as long as they don't discriminate on one of the protected status. So I would recommend to employers, though, that you have a really solid record there of what it is that's been reported, and that you've even given that employee who's subject to that to some ability to cure that, or ability to work through whatever that perception is. And then if that doesn't work, then yes, the employer should take the action that is geared toward preventing bullying and harassment and uncomfortable situations in the workplace. Isaac?
I didn't sit for the bar, so I'm gonna I'll pass. Thank you.
We're coming up on our end of our time, but I did want to open up the questions to the audience. If anyone has any specific questions to their business that they might like to ask. Yes, ma'am.
So unfortunately in Oklahoma, about half of the homicides that are committed are related to domestic violence. It's about 45%. And Isaac, you indicated that interpersonal violence in the workplace is radically different than some of the other types of opportunities for violence to come in the workplace. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure, and that's a great question. And for those that maybe couldn't hear it clearly, it was about domestic violence in the workplace and why it's challenging for employers. The way that OSHA defines the types of workplace violence is based on the relationship between the aggressor and the victim of the violence. And so, unfortunately, women are victims of violence in the workplace at a higher rate than men are. And the challenge for the employer in managing domestic violence that shows up at the workplace is you often don't have as much visibility to it. If the person that is the aggressor is not your employee, you have much less recourse in terms of managing that. And then you also have the angle that the person who's being victimized is your employee and likely is in need of some kind of support services. And so the lack of visibility to the situation, the sensitive nature of the dynamic, and the very often challenging intimate partner violence angle just makes it much more difficult for employers to have plans in place for. Whereas if you have an in-house employee who's got a conflict with another employee, then you can obviously have more visibility, potentially more recourse around the traditional HR channels. But there's also privacy matters involved. So what we talk to clients about is if and when an employee shows up and says to you, this is embarrassing, I'm getting divorced, it's not going well, I've been abused for years, my ex said he was going to show up here today, what should we do? And if the employer doesn't have a plan in place to support that person, if they don't have a plan in place to protect the broader workforce and the facility, you're really on your heels very quickly. And it's not, based on the numbers you just reported, 45%, no employer should say, well, what do you mean one of my employees could have been a domestic violence victim? That it's widely understood that that is a part of society that exists and that can find its way to the workplace. So the challenge is really just how do you manage it? It's sensitive, and how do you quickly stand up your security posture in the event that you become aware of a threat from somebody's home life? And it doesn't have to be a spouse or an ex-spouse. It could be an adult child. It could be somebody's brother who has a grievance about a shared vehicle and he shows up at the workplace to try and reclaim the vehicle and a fight happens. That's the same thing. It's the employer's thing to manage when it shows up at the workplace, but you likely wouldn't even know it was a hazard until it's volatile and it's shown up. So there's certainly going to be legal considerations around how you manage that circumstance. Because, for example, if an employee comes in and reports that as a hazard, it's now your hazard to help manage. But you also can't say like, well, for the good of the workforce, we're just going to let you go. We don't want you working here anymore, or we're going to relocate you to the basement until this resolves and change the scope of your work, right? So there are a lot of things that need to be accounted for in advance, so you're not improvising and potentially making things worse the day you become aware of it.
And I would just add to that because we have the Oklahoma Workplace Violence Protection Act, that doesn't apply only to an employer seeking that relief against an employee or a former employee. The language used in the act is defendant, and it is very broad. And I haven't seen it used this way yet, but I think it was written broad so that an employer would have a means to go to court and put that remedy in place if it involved this situation where a spouse comes to work or a person in a relationship comes to work and says, I've been threatened by my spouse, I've been threatened by this person I've had a relationship with, I think it could be violent. That is notice to the employer to do something more. And like Isaac says, it's not just we're going to put you in the basement or you're fired, leave. It is, okay, we need to do something, because firing that individual doesn't necessarily advise that defendant that they don't work there, and they still may come up there with the aim toward violence. And we've seen that in society. So I think the employer needs to do more, and I think even though the employer might look at this and says, oh great, we have to call a lawyer and go file this action to try to get the workplace victims protection order, so be it. That's part of the cost of doing business and providing a safe workplace. You look at that, and one of the questions I think will be, does the employer have liability for workplace violence that happens and injures bystanders? Maybe. And so in this situation, if that individual comes to the employer and says, I've been threatened by my husband, we're going through divorce, I think he could be violent, that's put that employer on notice that something could happen. And then unfortunately, and hopefully not, but if it ever does happen, then now that employer is going to be judged through that lens of, you knew, you had notice, you could have done this, and so I think employers really have to dust off, their policies and the procedures and look at situations like this, but assess it, and if it's credible and if it could become violent in the workplace, then take some action on it.
Another challenging angle on that topic is the type of business or the type of industry that you're in and whether or not you have access controls. So an office complex, you might get that information and just go downstairs, talk to the front door person and say, we're going to lock the facility. If you see a red pickup truck with this guy in it today, call police right away. That's an easier pathway to making the space more secure. If you're a retailer, if you're a fill in the blank, if you want to be open to the public so that your customer base can come and go freely, have a good customer experience, etc., restaurants, bars, anything to do with hospitality, you can't lock your doors. That's prohibitive to your business model. So that's a much different situation to think about and manage. And if you have a blended business model where you're doing a whole bunch of things, some of it's open to the public, some of it's not, your security plan, when you become aware of a threat, domestic violence or otherwise, needs to reflect that and be commensurate to the risk that exists. So the domestic violence component is much more challenging when you're in like a hospitality environment where the person could very well just come in and sit down at a table and order food. And if they've not done anything problematic yet, you might not even have grounds to ask that person to leave, or that might actually make things worse. So it's complicated, and having a plan in place in advance to manage it is really the best advice we can offer, so you're not improvising the day of. Great question, though. That's one of the most challenging components of this whole topic.
Anybody else?
So this is a little bit more on a practical level. What do you recommend you do if you are in a situation like that? Some things that come to mind that happened before at a church, at a mall, recently at a hospital, at a theater. What do you do? Do you run? Do you hide? Do you play dead? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so Department of Homeland Security offers probably the most broad and blanket guidance there. From an employer's perspective, having emergency action plans in place and training employees to it is kind of the business side of this conversation. But all of those things eventually boil down to our individual response and decision making. So the question about run, hide, fight, or if you're in a grocery, or if you're in a theater or a house of worship, those decisions can't be prescribed to a group of people the same way you could in a fire emergency. So the challenge on the active shooter front or an act of violence is individual assessment and readiness. So example, we're sitting in this theater. This is the first time I've ever been here. I don't know about you all, but everywhere I go, I'm scanning where are the exits, which way did I come in from, what's my alternate route out. And so in your personal life, as sad as it is to say this, as you're going places, you should be thinking about your exit strategy or your shelter options in the event of any kind of emergency. And the active shooter, active assailant examples of late, unfortunately, have been in places we all go all the time, and including street fairs. So how you assess those things and what your individual plan is really what it boils down to in most circumstances, even in your workplace. The example I gave from my former employment experience, the challenge in that environment was there were so many potential places that you could go. You got to think about what is the most direct path to safety, as opposed to should I go toward where my car is parked? Should I just go out into the community? And those are things that change in time based on where the threat actor is. So you might initially hide because that's your best option. And if you're hidden and you hear the threat coming toward you, you might have to pivot from your initial decision to hide, and now you're running, or now you're fighting, and it could move through all of those things. But really having your own state of mind prepared for whatever that circumstance might be is the best advice that can be offered, and that's why Homeland Security's advice is run, hide, fight, and the underlying message there is assess what's happening around you, make a decision, and respond accordingly. There's a lot of debate about if that's the most effective or the most efficient way to do it, but in its simplest form, that's essentially what you're doing. You're assessing it and managing it in real time as the threat evolves.
You touched on it a bit earlier, but to clarify, can a lawyer and an employer be held liable for failing to have a plan in place which is going to go wrong, or for failing to adequately address like interpersonal bullying issues between?
Well, the most basic answer is yes and yes. I mean, now there's always going to be situations that don't answer that easily, but can an employer be liable in those situations of not having a plan? If the employer had reason to think they needed to have the plan, then they can be liable for not having the plan. You can look at society right now and realize that whatever type of employer you are, you have reason to think you need to have a plan. That's because we've seen this year that violence has affected very normal things that we do in life. The last 6 shootings, it's been a school, a grocery store, a parade, a medical office, a shopping mall. So when you think about how violence has transcended into the things we do every day and all of the businesses and employers that are surrounding those things, to not have in place some type of plan and some type of training to your managers and supervisors and employees, then I think an employer could be held liable. Can an employer be held liable for not addressing harassment in the workplace? Absolutely. Can an employer be held liable for not addressing harassment by somebody who doesn't work for the employer, but like an independent contractor or a vendor or a customer? Absolutely. And so employers have to take notice that violence prevention and harassment assessment in the workplace and addressing those situations is as important as all of the other things on your slate of things you are managing and trying to administer in your workplace.
I think we're out of time. I have another question that might take a long time to answer, so I apologize, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If somebody shows up at a workplace with a gun and starts shooting, and there are other people present who have their own personal firearms, what kind of legal exposure would that individual have if he decides to take a stand, I'm going to protect everybody here? If something should happen to go wrong, he misses the shooter and ends up accidentally killing someone else. What exposure might that person have? What exposure might his employer have? And then another angle of that is if the police department shows up and there's multiple people firing guns and they shoot the wrong guy, what legal exposure might they have then, or that might carry over to the employer? I know that's a mouthful, and it's probably opening up a can of worms. But
I'm not an attorney, but it sounds like everyone's getting sued in that scenario, right?
It does, and it just underscores this whole issue in our society. The thing that's most important is the safety of people and the safety of people in the workplace. And if that employer had thought through and had in place these things we've talked about today and done the risk assessment that Isaac has talked about today, maybe they wouldn't have been in that situation. But let's say, unfortunately, they did those things or didn't do those things, and they are in that situation. I mean, let's be practical about it. Employers and people have potential liability for everything that they do. And it's just about, can a lawyer out there devise a set of facts that show that there was a duty to do something different, and there was a breach of that duty, and it caused somebody injury or damages. And if it fits into that model, then yes, the employer could be liable. The employee who's trying to address the situation could be liable. There's a whole different standard for police liability. Yes, everybody involved in those scenarios could find themselves as a party in a lawsuit. Realistically, is a jury going to award damages? I don't know. It just depends on the facts. Would a judge allow it to go to a jury? I don't know. Depend on the facts. There's no bright line legal standard that is going to protect that employer or that individual or that police department under all these potential scenarios. And so, again, it just highlights the importance to back up from that violent event. What could have been done and what can the employer do to, as best they can, address those situations so it doesn't get to that. And it deals with all these things we talked about. The thinking about the issues and the problem, spending some time and resources addressing it ahead of time, and then having a good workplace with good communications top to bottom to where people feel valued for what they're doing by coming to work every day.
Well, all right. I think we've had a real positive discussion. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to entertain, but otherwise I think we might call it a day. We appreciate our speakers. You guys have been very informative, and I think the plan would be to post the recording on our website, the Journal Record website. Is that correct? So if you want to go back and review, take notes. But we appreciate everyone coming out.
Thank you.